Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the world of Viking relationships, where love wasn't always the main focus, and divorce was surprisingly chill. Imagine you're living in Viking Scandinavia. You've just been handed a large mug of mead and are staring out over the icy fjords. It's the 9th century, and the Viking lifestyle is tough, rugged, and, let's be honest, full of unromantic practicality. Sure, there were love stories, but when it came to marriages, they were mostly business deals. And if it didn't work out, divorce was something you could handle without drama. In fact, Viking divorces were kind of, well, no big deal. But before you start feeling jealous of their simplicity, just think about this. If you had a bad marriage back then, it probably wasn't about falling out of love. It was about surviving, managing your resources, and making sure your status wasn't tarnished. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Post your location in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start at the beginning. Viking marriages. Despite their fierce reputation, Vikings didn't spend their days fighting to win hearts. Their marriages were often built around the practicalities of life. Sure, there were people who loved each other, but for the most part, marriage was about creating alliances, securing property, and ensuring your bloodline thrived. Marrying for status wasn't just about bragging rights. It was about survival in a harsh, unforgiving world. For Viking men, marriage was the ultimate way to secure their legacy. If you were a high-ranking warrior, you'd marry into a family with good land, resources, or political ties. Women, on the other hand, weren't just there to raise children. They often handled the day-to-day operations of the household and had significant sway in decision-making. In Viking society, both parties had the power to negotiate their future, and divorce was just one of those negotiations. Historically, Viking marriages involved several rituals to seal the deal. We'll get into that in the next section. But for now, just know that it wasn't about putting on fancy rings or having a grand ceremony. It was more about setting expectations and ensuring that everyone knew their role. And when those expectations weren't met, divorce was just as easy as negotiating a new deal. No big emotional fallout, no long, drawn-out court battles, just a matter of making sure both parties could move on with their lives, preferably with as much property and power as possible. Now, let's take a closer look at the rules of Viking marriages. You'd think that the famously fierce Vikings might have had some intense, emotional weddings full of big speeches and grand gestures. But no, the reality was far less romantic. Marriages were more like contracts. You were marrying for your clan's prosperity, not necessarily because you had fallen head over heels for someone. It's not exactly the type of thing you'd see in a rom-com, more like a business partnership, but with a side of mead and firelight. Viking marriages were mostly arranged, and they usually revolved around practical concerns like land ownership, alliances, and securing heirs. Picture this. You're a Viking warrior. Maybe you're not the most charming guy, but you've got some solid land and a bit of influence. You want to secure your bloodline and ensure that your property stays in the family, so you find a suitable match. The woman would likely come from a family that could bring something to the table, whether that was land, livestock, or connections. Love? Well, that wasn't the top priority, though it didn't mean it was totally absent. The couple would exchange promises, sometimes in front of witnesses, and then, voila, they were married. But what if things didn't work out? What if the relationship wasn't so, well, romantic? Vikings had a very practical approach to that too. Divorce wasn't a taboo subject. It wasn't something to be ashamed of. In fact, the process was almost as easy as getting married, but with a little more paperwork. Well, maybe not paperwork in the way we know it today, but you get the idea. And, believe it or not, both men and women had the right to seek a divorce. A Viking man could divorce his wife if she failed in her duties, whether that was managing the household or failing to provide heirs. On the flip side, a woman could also initiate divorce if her husband wasn't fulfilling his side of the bargain, or if he was abusive, unfaithful, or simply not pulling his weight. Historians still argue whether Viking women had more freedom than those in other medieval societies, but one thing is for sure. Divorce was an option for both parties. No shame, no drama, just an amicable split. It's almost like Vikings were ahead of their time in terms of relationship equality. They didn't get bogged down with unnecessary emotions. Instead, they focused on practicality. Marriages weren't about forever, but about survival and community stability. If it didn't work out, they moved on. It's hard to imagine such a no-nonsense approach today, but back then, it was the norm. And believe me, there's a lot more to Viking divorce than just practicality. You'll be surprised how much their process had in common with modern-day divorce, but without all the courtroom drama. So, let's talk about Viking wedding rituals. When you think of Viking weddings, you might imagine grand feasts and massive celebrations with endless mead and warriors boasting of their feats. But actually, Viking weddings were a lot simpler than that, and definitely more practical than flashy. There were no big white dresses, no flower girls, and certainly no over-the-top wedding planners. Instead, the ceremony was more about sealing the deal between two families rather than declaring eternal love to the world. And the rituals? They weren't about romance. They were about ensuring the survival of the community. First off, the couple didn't exchange vows like we do today. There wasn't a, "Do you take this person to be your lawfully wedded spouse?" moment. Instead, the wedding was focused on agreements and promises. It was about making sure both families knew their responsibilities and what would be expected from each side. A good marriage wasn't about passion. It was about securing your land, resources, and lineage. This could involve formal agreements made with witnesses present to ensure no one would back out. In fact, it was just as much about negotiating as it was about tying the knot. Once the marriage contract was made, there were probably feasts, but they were more about celebrating the union of two families than showcasing some Hollywood-style extravagance. You could imagine some hearty Viking food, perhaps a roasted boar or plenty of bread and cheese, all washed down with mead. People probably sang and danced, but more likely they discussed business. After all, that's what Viking life was all about. They were practical folks, even in matters of marriage. Think of it like a contract signed in front of a crowd to make it official. That crowd. Not friends with gifts. These were your future in-laws, neighbors, and fellow villagers. Interestingly, Viking wedding rituals also had their share of superstitions. Some believe that the Vikings might have used symbolic gestures during the ceremony, such as the bride offering a small gift to the groom or touching sacred objects to make their union official. There were even certain prayers or blessings to ensure fertility and protection for the family. Vikings were pragmatic, but they also knew that a little divine favor could go a long way. The gods, after all, had a big say in Viking life, especially when it came to something as important as family and the continuation of a bloodline. Historians still argue whether the Viking weddings were truly solemn affairs, or if they were more relaxed and celebratory. There's evidence of both formal ceremonies and less structured gatherings. Some believe the formal part of the wedding was done with a legal contract, while the feast afterward was the true wedding part, an expression of communal celebration, not religious devotion. But one thing is for sure. There was no grand "I do" moment, and there was certainly no honeymoon. The couple was married, sure, but life, as usual, resumed immediately after the ceremony. The focus wasn't on romance or an idealized version of love. It was about getting things done and making sure everything, from land to children, was secured for the future. In a world where death could come at any time in battle or from harsh conditions, marriages were about legacy, not the grand displays we see today. Now, let's dive into the role of women in Viking society. You might be surprised to learn that Viking women weren't just cooking and cleaning while their husbands were off raiding. They were vital parts of Viking society, holding a range of important responsibilities that went beyond the household. While the Vikings were a warrior culture, they recognized the importance of strong, capable women. In fact, many women in Viking society had considerable autonomy, which was not exactly common in other parts of the world during this time. First of all, Viking women had the right to own property. This might sound basic, but it was a big deal in the 9th century. Women could inherit land, manage estates, and even initiate legal actions if necessary. This was very different from most other medieval societies, where women's rights were often limited, and their wealth was considered the property of their husbands or fathers. But Viking women had control over their own property, and if a marriage ended in divorce, they could retain their wealth. The idea of a woman owning property was seen as natural and integral to Viking life. and it was a key factor in divorce negotiations. In addition to property ownership, women had a significant role in Viking family life. They managed the home, but that wasn't just about keeping the place clean. They were in charge of domestic affairs, including supervising the servants, tending to livestock, and even overseeing the food supply. Essentially, women were the ones running the day-to-day operations of the household, while men were off fighting or raiding. Some Viking women were even skilled in crafts and trade, and could take part in business ventures. If you were a Viking woman, it was pretty likely you'd know how to handle a sword, a loom, or a trading ledger. But it wasn't just domestic roles that women played. Many historians believe that some Viking women also participated in raids and battles. We've all heard of the famous Valkyries, the warrior women who supposedly accompanied the gods into battle. While the Valkyries are mostly mythological figures, there's some evidence to suggest that Viking women didn't just sit at home while the men went to war. Some women, like Lagertha, a legendary figure in Viking lore, were depicted as fierce warriors themselves. Whether or not these women were part of actual Viking raids remains debated, but the idea of women as warriors wasn't far-fetched in Viking culture. Historians still argue whether the role of women in Viking society was truly egalitarian, or if it was more a reflection of a unique societal structure where gender roles were more fluid. Either way, Viking women had more freedom than women in many other contemporary societies. They could own land, make decisions, and, crucially, divorce their husbands if things went wrong. This wasn't a world where women were confined to the shadows. They were out in the open, actively shaping the world around them. Whether that meant overseeing the household, managing business, or even holding a sword. The ability to divorce and retain property was revolutionary in its own right. In fact, women's rights were so respected in Viking society that divorce wasn't considered a shameful act. If a marriage didn't work, a woman could take control of her destiny, making sure she wasn't left destitute and powerless. It was an incredibly progressive attitude for a society that lived so long ago. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of Viking divorce and how it compares to modern divorces. Spoiler, it's way less complicated. If you think about today's divorce process, it can often feel like a drawn-out battle. You've got lawyers, courts, custody battles, property division, and, let's face it, a whole lot of paperwork. In Viking times, divorce wasn't nearly as messy. In fact, Viking divorce was more about mutual consent and practicality than courtroom drama. The beauty of it was, there wasn't a long, drawn-out fight to get out of a marriage. If both parties agreed, the divorce was as simple as calling it quits. Imagine that. No complex negotiations or bitter legal battles. It was more like saying, "Hey, this isn't working, so let's move on," and getting back to business. In Viking society, both men and women could initiate a divorce, which was a pretty progressive concept for the time. As long as there was a good reason, whether that was a failure to produce heirs, failure to fulfill marital duties, or even some kind of mistreatment, the person who wanted the divorce could make it happen. If the wife wanted out, she could bring the issue to the local assembly or lawman. This wasn't about dragging things out for months or years. It was about making sure that everyone's needs were met. And if that wasn't happening, it was time to part ways. But while the divorce was easier than you might expect, it wasn't always about a clean break. Divorce in Viking times often involved negotiations about property, money, and children. In a society where wealth and land meant everything, making sure that both parties were taken care of financially was a big part of the process. Women were particularly well protected in this regard. If a Viking woman wanted to get divorced, she would likely keep her property, her children, unless the husband was in a better position to care for them, and any wealth she had brought into the marriage. It was a kind of you get what you came with approach, which was pretty fair considering the harshness of Viking life. The process of divorce wasn't about punishing anyone or creating bitterness. It was practical. If things weren't working, the couple would part ways, and each person would move on to the next chapter of their life. Imagine how refreshing that must have been. No bitter public divorce battles. You didn't need a therapist or a mediator or to pay expensive legal fees. It was about efficiency and practicality. If you had a bad marriage, no one was going to judge you for wanting out. Historians still argue whether Viking divorce was as common as we think, or if it was more of a rare occurrence. Some believe that Vikings simply didn't divorce much because the social structures were strong enough to keep people together. Others think that divorce was common, but not often talked about in the historical records. Either way, one thing is certain. The Viking approach to divorce was far less complicated than what we're used to today. No messy court proceedings or endless fighting. It was just another part of Viking society's ability to adapt and move on. So next time you hear someone complain about their messy divorce, just remember, the Vikings had it figured out way before we did. They weren't bogged down with unnecessary complications. And honestly, it sounds like something we could all learn from. Let's now turn our attention to Viking law codes, the backbone of their society. And yes, they had laws for everything, including divorce. Viking society was governed by a combination of customary law and oral traditions. But there were also written codes that laid out exactly what would happen if you decided to end your marriage. One of the most famous collections of these laws was known as the Gragas, which was a legal code used in Iceland, one of the key Viking territories. It was a detailed guide for many aspects of life, from how to settle a property dispute to how to handle divorce. In Viking society, the law wasn't just about protecting the people. It was also about ensuring stability. The Gragas emphasized fairness, and in the case of divorce, it was no different. Both parties had rights, and divorce wasn't something that required a great deal of formal proceedings. As long as the divorce was agreed upon, it was handled with relative ease. There was no need for lengthy trials or mediators. Instead, both parties simply took their case to the local thing, the Viking assembly where legal matters were settled. Think of it as a community-based tribunal, where a group of people would gather to resolve issues. If both parties agreed to the divorce, they would announce it, and the matter would be settled right then and there. While Viking law certainly had its complexities, it was designed to be efficient. People didn't need to hire lawyers or go through the bureaucratic red tape that we deal with today. You just needed to prove that the marriage had failed to meet the required expectations, and that was enough to dissolve the union. Of course, the expectations were pretty clear. If your spouse wasn't living up to their duties, whether that was managing the household, being faithful, or producing children, it was fair game to seek a divorce. And these matters were treated as seriously as any other law violation. But what if the divorce wasn't mutual? What if one person wasn't quite ready to let go? Well, Viking society also had provisions to handle those cases. If one party refused to agree to the divorce, the other could seek support from the community or the lawman. There were mechanisms in place to ensure that no one was trapped in a marriage they didn't want to be in. And even if the person didn't want to leave, the law made sure that their spouse could still be granted the freedom to do so. The thing would act as a mediator to make sure that everyone had a fair chance at getting what they deserved. Historians still argue over the specifics of Viking divorce law. Some believe that the Gragas was an idealized version of Viking legal practices, and that divorce in everyday Viking life was far less formal than the code suggests. Others think that the written laws were actually fairly representative of what happened on the ground. But either way, the Viking approach to divorce was clearly a step ahead of many societies of the time. It wasn't complicated or drawn out. It was efficient, and it kept things running smoothly. In a time when survival was the top priority, no one had time to get bogged down in personal drama. Viking law didn't just have a practical approach to divorce. It had an open-minded one, too. The idea that both men and women had the ability to initiate divorce was revolutionary. It allowed for a level of equality and fairness that wasn't common in many other cultures at the time. The law ensured that both parties could move on and rebuild their lives if the marriage didn't work out, without too much interference from outsiders. In a way, the Vikings were pioneers in relationship equality. They might not have had the most emotional marriages, but they certainly had a practical, fair, and efficient way of ending them when necessary. Let's explore Viking emotional distance and how it shaped their approach to divorce. If you were a Viking, you probably weren't the type to wear your heart on your sleeve, at least not in the way we do today. Viking society wasn't known for its emotional openness. In fact, it was a culture that valued stoicism and resilience. They didn't indulge in over-the-top emotional expressions or public displays of affection. It wasn't about being lovey-dovey or swooning over your partner in romantic gestures. The Vikings, both men and women, were far more focused on surviving and thriving in the harsh conditions of their world. Now, this emotional reserve doesn't mean that Vikings didn't form strong bonds. Far from it. But these bonds were often pragmatic rather than romantic. Love and affection might have been present, but they were secondary to the primary goal of ensuring family survival and community stability. A marriage was a contract, and like any contract, it could be dissolved when it no longer served its purpose. When divorce came into play, it wasn't viewed as a personal failure or emotional breakdown. It was a matter of practicality. Vikings didn't dwell on their feelings. They didn't engage in endless drama when something wasn't working out. If you had a bad marriage, you didn't spend years stewing in anger, bitterness, or self-pity. You simply moved on. And part of that emotional distance also meant that divorce wasn't treated as a scandal. In fact, in some cases, it wasn't even seen as an unusual or negative event. A Viking divorce was often handled matter-of-factly, like signing a business deal or making a pragmatic decision. It wasn't about emotional devastation. It was about what worked and what didn't. Historians still argue over how emotionally distant Viking marriages truly were. Some believe that this emotional detachment was an essential part of Viking life, a way of adapting to a tough and unpredictable world. Others suggest that the Vikings were more emotionally involved than we give them credit for, particularly in their familial and romantic relationships. Whatever the case may be, the key takeaway is that divorce wasn't emotional for Vikings in the way it often is for us today. It wasn't a dramatic end to a romantic story. It was just another part of their structured, survival-oriented society. The emotional distance also meant that Vikings were far less likely to hold grudges or engage in vindictive behavior after a divorce. Once the divorce was finalized, both parties could move forward without a long period of conflict or resentment. It was pragmatic and efficient, and the focus was on moving on rather than reliving past hurts. The emotional toll of a divorce was likely less than what we experience today, because the cultural framework simply didn't encourage emotional dependency. It was about self-reliance, independence, and practical survival, something that made divorce a lot less complicated. Viking emotional detachment wasn't just about marriage either. It was woven into their whole way of life. The Vikings were warriors, explorers, and traders. They had to be resilient and strong in the face of hardship, and that meant not getting bogged down by feelings. So, when a marriage didn't work out, it wasn't about emotional collapse. It was about doing what needed to be done to ensure that everyone could move forward and continue thriving. Let's now look at the role of family and clan in Viking divorce. In Viking society, family and kin were everything. The importance of your clan, your bloodline, and your extended family wasn't just a sentimental notion. It was crucial to your survival. So, when a divorce happened, it wasn't just about the two people involved. The broader family network played a significant role in the process, and their interests had to be considered. Divorce wasn't just a personal decision. It had social and economic ramifications that affected the entire clan. One of the key features of Viking society was its strong sense of community. You were bound to your family and to your people in ways that went far beyond the nuclear family we think of today. This was a time when loyalty and support from your clan could be the difference between life and death, and when marriage was used as a way to solidify and strengthen those ties. So, when divorce was considered, it wasn't simply a matter of the two people involved. It was something that had ripple effects throughout the family. Interestingly, Viking divorce wasn't just about the individual's desires. It was often a collective decision. In some cases, extended family members might have been consulted, especially when there were disputes over property, land, or children. If a divorce was necessary, the local thing, the Viking assembly, would often be called to help resolve the matter. This wasn't an impersonal court system. It was a public gathering, where members of the community played a direct role in deciding the outcome of the divorce. This helped ensure that everyone's interests were considered, and that divorce wasn't a hasty or unilateral decision. The role of the extended family network also meant that divorce didn't necessarily mean a complete severing of ties. Even after a divorce, there was still an expectation that both parties would maintain a level of respect and cooperation, especially if children were involved. Families were interconnected, and maintaining good relationships between divorced couples was important for the overall stability of the community. It wasn't uncommon for divorced couples to remain on friendly terms, if only for the sake of their kinship or mutual alliances. Historians still debate the extent to which the family network influenced Viking divorce, but one thing is clear. Viking society placed a heavy emphasis on the collective over the individual. Marriages and divorces weren't just personal choices. They were part of a larger social framework where family ties, communal interests, and economic considerations all came into play. This is why Viking divorce was often more practical than emotional. It was as much about maintaining the stability of the clan as it was about the individuals involved. While we might think of divorce as a personal matter today, for the Vikings, it was a social transaction that involved a wider network of people. And while it might seem strange to us, this communal approach made a lot of sense in a time when survival depended on strong family bonds and a unified community. The Vikings didn't just think about their own happiness. They thought about the greater good of their family and their clan. Divorce wasn't about emotional rupture. It was about making sure everyone could go their separate ways without threatening the stability of the broader social fabric. Now, let's talk about whether Viking divorces were really fair splits. When a marriage ended, who walked away with what? Was it a fair division of property and assets, or did the men get the lion's share? Viking divorce, while rooted in practicality, also had a sense of fairness to it. The society understood that marriages weren't just about personal relationships. They were about securing assets, wealth, and status. So, when it came to divorce, each party had their entitlements, and these were usually respected. But, as with most things in Viking culture, the fairness was all about balance. How well you could navigate your legal rights and the customs of your community. When a Viking woman divorced, she didn't lose everything she brought into the marriage. Unlike in many other societies, she could retain her property, and any wealth she inherited or brought into the marriage was hers to keep. This was an essential aspect of Viking law. Women had significant rights when it came to divorce. If you were a woman in Viking society, you didn't have to worry about being left penniless or without a place to live if the marriage fell apart. The rights of property and inheritance were respected, which ensured that women could maintain a certain level of independence even after a divorce. The fairness in Viking divorce lay in the fact that both men and women could expect to retain what was rightfully theirs. On the flip side, Viking men also had certain expectations when it came to divorce. If the wife had been unfaithful or didn't live up to her duties, he could seek a divorce and would generally be entitled to the land and property they'd acquired together. But the interesting thing is that while men were often seen as the heads of households, Viking society understood the importance of women's roles in managing those households. So while men could expect compensation for any land or resources they brought into the marriage, the wife could also expect a fair share of property or assets they had accumulated together. However, there were cases where the split wasn't as straightforward. If the couple had children, then there could be issues of guardianship, and this added another layer to the divorce. Children in Viking society were considered a critical part of the family's future, and decisions regarding their custody could be influenced by their importance to the family's survival and reputation. In the case of divorce, the father generally had rights to the children, but Viking law also ensured that mothers played a role in their children's upbringing. Historians still debate whether Viking custody laws were truly fair to women, or if the system favored men. Some argue that it depended on the situation and the local customs of the community. But overall, the Viking approach to divorce was relatively fair for both parties, especially compared to other societies of the time. Women weren't left destitute, and men didn't lose everything they had worked for. It wasn't about revenge or punitive measures. It was about splitting the assets in a way that kept the peace and respected the rights of both parties. The Vikings knew that a peaceful divorce helped ensure that everyone could go their separate ways without causing instability in the community. This practical approach made divorce just another part of Viking life, not something to be feared or stigmatized. Historians still argue whether Viking divorce was truly equitable, especially in the cases of child custody, or when the divorce wasn't mutual. Some believe that men had more power than the law codes suggest, while others think that women had more rights and freedom than we've previously given them credit for. Regardless, Viking divorce was undoubtedly more balanced and fair than most people realize. It wasn't about punishing one party. It was about ensuring that both sides could continue their lives with the resources they needed to survive. It was pragmatic, fair, and reflective of Viking society's deep sense of practicality. Next up, let's dig into Viking divorce and property rights. This part of the story is where things get really interesting, because Viking divorce wasn't just about emotions or personal grievances. It was about wealth, status, and, most importantly, property. For the Vikings, property wasn't just about ownership. It was about power. Who controlled land and resources controlled the future. So, when a marriage ended, the property wasn't something that could simply be divided in a careless, half-hearted way. No, the distribution of property after a divorce was crucial to the survival of both individuals involved, and it was taken very seriously. In Viking society, when a divorce occurred, the property division was heavily influenced by the dowry system, which meant that the wealth and land each partner brought into the marriage stayed with them when they separated. The concept of dowry might seem like something from another time and place, but in the Viking world, it was a common practice. Women typically brought property and goods into their marriages, either as part of the deal or through inheritance. This was important, because when a divorce occurred, these items or properties weren't just taken away by the husband. Instead, the woman had the right to retain what she brought with her. Now, what about the men? When it came to land or resources acquired after the marriage, the split was more complicated. Viking men didn't always get to keep everything just because they were the ones who initiated the divorce. In fact, they could lose some of the property if they didn't take good care of it, or if the woman had a stronger claim to it. If the wife was the one to bring the property into the marriage, and that property had increased in value or significance over time, the woman had the right to claim it back. This was important in a society where land and wealth were vital for social status and survival. Even if a woman wasn't the primary landowner, she still had the right to a share of any wealth accumulated through the marriage. If the woman wanted to leave with her property, she could, and if the man wanted to divorce, he had to make sure she was compensated fairly. Historians still argue whether Viking property laws were fully equitable in all cases, particularly when it came to the division of larger estates or lands. Some believe that, in practice, men had the upper hand and were able to manipulate the laws in their favor. Others argue that Viking women had greater property rights than women in other medieval societies, and that the Viking legal system gave women an unprecedented level of autonomy and security. However, what's clear is that Viking property laws were designed to protect the assets and status of both parties, ensuring that a divorce wouldn't result in financial ruin for either side. Viking property rights weren't just about keeping your land. They were about ensuring that your social position was secure. Whether you were a man or a woman, losing your property after a divorce could mean losing your place in Viking society. And that wasn't something anyone could afford. This sense of financial security during and after a divorce likely contributed to the relatively low social stigma surrounding Viking divorce. It wasn't about losing everything. It was about maintaining what you had. So, even though divorce in Viking society was something people rarely talked about, it was something that was handled with respect, fairness, and a solid understanding of the practical needs of both parties. Let's move on to some famous Viking divorces, because believe it or not, some Viking breakups became quite the talk of their time. While Viking society didn't exactly indulge in the dramatic, headline-grabbing divorces we see in modern times, there were a few notable splits that became the subject of sagas, stories, and gossip. These divorces weren't just about love gone wrong. They were about power struggles, politics, and legacy, all wrapped up in the business of marriage. The Vikings, with their fierce desire for survival and control, had a knack for making even the most personal matters into public spectacles. One of the most famous figures in Viking history to have a notable divorce was the legendary Viking warrior and chieftain, Harald Fairhair. Harald was the first king of Norway, and he had a reputation for being both a fierce leader and a man with a complicated love life. He married a woman named Ragnhild, but after many years together, their marriage came to an end. The reasons for the divorce are somewhat unclear. Some sources claim that Harald simply fell out of love with her, while others suggest that political factors played a role in their separation. Whatever the case, it was clear that this divorce wasn't just about personal feelings. It had political ramifications. After his divorce from Ragnhild, Harald married another woman who helped him strengthen his alliances and further his ambitions as king. Another famous divorce in Viking lore involves Eirik the Red, the famous Norse explorer who founded the first Norse settlements in Greenland. Eirik had a complicated personal life, marked by family feuds, bold adventures, and, of course, a divorce. He was married to Thiodhild, and while the details of their divorce remain unclear, some sources suggest that Eric's constant travels and quest for adventure might have strained their relationship. His divorce wasn't just a personal matter. It marked a turning point in his life. Following the split, Eric's relationship with his family and his desire to explore new lands became even more pronounced. Some historians speculate that the divorce may have pushed him to seek new horizons, leading to his famous journey to Greenland. The cases of Harald Fairhair and Eirik the Red show us that Viking divorces weren't just simple matters of incompatible personalities. They were deeply connected to politics, power, and ambition. The Vikings didn't just marry and divorce for emotional reasons. They used marriage and divorce as tools for personal and political gain. In a society where alliances were everything, getting married or divorced could be a strategic move that had far-reaching consequences for your wealth, your influence, and your legacy. Historians still debate the true motivations behind these famous Viking divorces. Were they purely political? Were they personal betrayals or failures? Did they even matter in the larger scheme of Viking society? One thing's for sure. These stories of Viking breakups offer a glimpse into the complexity of their relationships. It wasn't just about who you loved. It was about how your relationships affected your standing in society. Even divorce, in the Viking world, wasn't just a personal matter. It was a social and political statement. Now, let's take a look at Viking divorce and Norse mythology, because it wasn't just about pragmatic decision-making and property rights. Viking divorce was also influenced by the powerful and sometimes unpredictable forces of the gods. Norse mythology, with its rich tapestry of gods, giants, and magical creatures, played a major role in Viking life, including their personal relationships. In a culture where the divine had a say in nearly every aspect of daily life, It's no surprise that even the act of divorce was colored by mythology and spiritual beliefs. Take, for example, the influence of the goddess Frigg, the Norse goddess of marriage and fertility. Frigg was believed to be the protector of households, marriage, and family, and was often invoked by those seeking blessings for their relationships. Her role as a goddess of marriage and family meant that, in the event of a divorce, many Vikings would have sought her favor for protection and stability. If a marriage was coming to an end, the gods had to be appeased. It wasn't just about parting ways. It was about ensuring that the gods would continue to protect you after the separation. But it wasn't just positive divine intervention that influenced divorce. The god Loki, known for his trickery and chaos, could also be invoked in times of conflict. Loki's influence over relationships wasn't as benign as Frigg's. His role in Viking mythology was often as a troublemaker, one who caused mischief and stirred the pot. If things in a marriage went wrong, it could be attributed to the mischief of Loki, who was believed to sow discord and confusion in relationships. If a Viking couple found themselves unable to reconcile their differences, it might be blamed on Loki's interference. The belief in these supernatural forces added another layer to the already complex world of Viking divorce. The gods were never far from the Vikings' minds, especially when the future of a marriage was at stake. Moreover, Viking divorce rituals sometimes included offerings or rituals to the gods, asking for blessings or a smooth transition into post-marriage life. There were likely ceremonies where individuals would seek divine approval or guidance before they could move forward. Historians speculate that the Vikings believed that ending a marriage without such rites could lead to bad luck or misfortune. In a world where personal survival was often tied to fate, a divorce wasn't just an earthly decision. It could have heavenly consequences. Historians still argue whether Norse mythology had any real influence on divorce practices, or if these beliefs were simply woven into the Vikings' understanding of their world. Some scholars suggest that while the gods played a symbolic role in the Vikings' day-to-day decisions, the actual practice of divorce was likely more practical and less mythologically charged. But others point to the fact that so many aspects of Viking life were governed by spiritual beliefs, including death, battle, and fortune. It makes sense that the dissolution of a marriage, one of the most important personal decisions a person could make, would also be influenced by their gods. Viking divorce wasn't just a legal or personal matter. It was also tied to their deep spirituality. They saw their relationships not just in terms of human emotion, but as part of a much larger divine plan. Whether invoking Frigg for blessings or blaming Loki for a marriage's demise, the gods were woven into the fabric of Viking relationships and played a crucial role in the decisions surrounding divorce. This unique intersection of law, myth, and spirituality is part of what made Viking divorce so different from our modern understanding. Let's now walk through the actual process of Viking divorce, step by step. You might imagine that, given the Vikings' reputation for being fierce warriors and hardy adventurers, their divorces would be just as intense as their battles. But, surprisingly, Viking divorce was much simpler, and it didn't involve courtroom drama or long-winded trials. It was, in many ways, a straightforward process, a matter of legal and social procedure rather than emotional chaos. If you were living in Viking Scandinavia and found yourself in a marriage that wasn't working, you'd need to follow a few key steps to officially break things off. First and foremost, the reason for divorce needed to be clear and justifiable. This wasn't a culture that entertained divorce simply because two people grew tired of each other. No, Viking divorce was rooted in practicality, and it had to be based on solid grounds. If your spouse had violated the terms of the marriage, whether that was failing to produce heirs, being unfaithful, or failing to perform their marital duties, you could seek a divorce. On the other hand, if your partner had been abusive or neglectful, that would have also been grounds for separation. The idea was to end a marriage when it no longer served its purpose, whether due to personal failure, neglect, or a breakdown in the essential functions of the union. Once the grounds were established, the next step was to gather witnesses. Yes, even for a divorce. Vikings loved a good public event, and divorce was no exception. The divorce proceedings would often be carried out in front of a local thing, the assembly where legal matters were settled. This assembly wasn't just a few people sitting around, drinking mead and making decisions. It was a serious gathering of elders, legal experts, and other community members who would help determine the outcome. At this thing, the couple would announce their intention to divorce, and the terms would be settled right there. It was a bit like a public negotiation. The couple would declare their reasons for divorce, and the assembly would decide on the practical matters, such as the division of property, custody of children, and any financial compensation. One of the most interesting aspects of Viking divorce was that both parties had a right to request their divorce in front of the thing, but they also had the option to handle it privately. In some cases, the divorce could be settled in a more informal manner between the couple and their families, without the need for public scrutiny. However, most Viking divorces were formalized at the assembly, and the community's involvement was crucial in ensuring that the divorce was fair. In Viking society, divorce was a communal matter. It affected not just the couple, but the wider clan. Keeping things fair and respectful was vital for maintaining harmony within the community. Once the divorce was officially declared, the final part of the process was the division of property and wealth. This is where the pragmatic nature of Viking divorce really shines. Viking law made sure that both parties kept what they had brought into the marriage. If the woman had inherited land or wealth, she would retain it. If the man had brought property or land, he kept it. In cases where both parties had contributed to the acquisition of property during the marriage, the assembly would decide how to divide the assets. This wasn't just a matter of who gets the house. It was about securing financial stability for both individuals. It's easy to imagine that, while these divorces weren't marked by emotional distress, They were marked by a deep sense of fairness and practicality. Once everything was settled, property, custody, and the ceremonial aspects of the divorce, both parties could move on with their lives, free from the constraints of an unhappy marriage. It wasn't about bitterness. It was about securing a better future for everyone involved. Historians still argue about whether this process was universally followed across all Viking territories. Some suggest that the local customs of different Viking regions might have influenced how divorces were carried out. Still, one thing is clear. Viking divorce was organized, fair, and practical, with a focus on resolving the matter as efficiently as possible. No messy breakups, no prolonged fights, just a clear-cut decision to separate and go your own way. Let's now ask the question, did Vikings remarry after divorce? If so, how did that work? Well, in Viking society, remarriage wasn't just allowed. It was actually quite common. Divorce wasn't seen as an end to one's romantic or social life. It was simply a reorganization of personal affairs. Since marriage was so often about securing alliances, maintaining family power, and ensuring property rights, there was little shame in remarriage. After all, Vikings didn't waste time mourning lost relationships. Their society was centered around survival, conquest, and moving forward. If a divorce happened, remarriage was just another step in the ongoing dance of securing your future. Viking men and women often remarried fairly quickly after a divorce. For men, remarriage could help them secure better political alliances, more land, or even more wealth. The women, on the other hand, often remarried to ensure they had a stable household and continued to maintain control over the property and wealth they had inherited or acquired during their first marriage. It was all about practicality, both for personal stability and for maintaining a strong family presence in the community. If a woman had property or land, she would likely seek out another husband who could help her manage or protect that wealth. If she didn't have property, she would often marry someone who had it, as a way of ensuring that her future and the future of her children were secure. But it wasn't just about financial security. Love, affection, and companionship could also play a role in remarriage, even if they weren't the primary motivation. The Vikings didn't entirely eschew romantic relationships, despite their emphasis on survival and practicality. In fact, remarriage could be an opportunity for a second chance at love, or at least for a better partnership. While their marriages were primarily about survival and alliances, Vikings weren't heartless. Many Vikings sought partners they could connect with emotionally, and a successful remarriage could bring personal satisfaction, as well as social and financial gain. There's some evidence to suggest that the Viking community didn't look down on remarriage after a divorce. In fact, many Viking laws and customs allowed for quick and easy remarriage. There was no societal stigma around starting over with a new partner. After all, it was understood that marriages could fail, just as businesses could fail or alliances could break down. The Vikings, pragmatic as they were, saw divorce and remarriage as a natural part of life's cycles. The idea was that the longer you could stay alive, the more alliances you could make, and the more opportunities you could take advantage of. Historians still debate whether there were specific customs or rituals involved in remarriage, especially regarding how quickly it could happen. Some believe that there were informal customs, like formal announcements or celebrations, while others argue that remarriage could take place almost immediately after a divorce was finalized. Either way, remarriage was never something that was frowned upon or treated as an oddity in Viking culture. It was just another part of the social system that helped keep the clan and family strong. One thing is clear: Vikings didn't waste time after a divorce. They moved on, remarried, and continued on with their lives as if nothing had happened. It was a pragmatic, matter-of-fact approach that helped keep Viking society strong, stable, and constantly evolving. It's hard not to admire their efficiency. No lingering sadness, no shame, just the next logical step in the ever-evolving journey of Viking life. It's a reminder that the Vikings were not a people who held on to the past. They were forward-thinking and always looking for the next opportunity, whether that meant remarrying for love or for property. Let's now take a moment to discuss the impact of Viking divorce on children. While much of the focus around Viking divorce has been on the rights of the adults involved, it's important to recognize that divorce also had significant effects on the children of these unions. After all, the Vikings were not just a group of lone warriors. They were also parents, raising the next generation of Norsemen and Norsewomen. So, when a divorce occurred, it wasn't just about the division of property or wealth. It was also about how the children would be affected, particularly in a society where lineage and family were so important. In many cases, Viking children were raised in multi-generational households, often surrounded by extended family members who had a direct role in their upbringing. This meant that even if parents divorced, children were not necessarily cast adrift. Extended family, like grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins, often played a major role in raising children. So even if their parents split up, the kids were still surrounded by a stable family network. This communal approach to raising children meant that the emotional and social impact of divorce was somewhat mitigated by the involvement of a larger support system. That being said, there were definitely challenges for children of divorced Viking parents. The father generally had more rights when it came to custody, and in most cases, the children would remain with him after the divorce. The reasoning behind this had to do with the Viking belief that the father was the one who would ensure that the family's resources and legacy were protected. The children of the marriage were, of course, seen as the heirs to this legacy, so it made sense for them to stay with their father. But this didn't mean that the mother was excluded from the children's lives. While she may not have had full custody, a Viking mother still had the right to remain actively involved in her children's upbringing. In Viking society, the concept of kinship was key. Even after divorce, children maintained a connection to both parents, and they were likely to spend time with each parent, depending on the family's circumstances. Historians still debate whether divorce impacted children's emotional well-being in Viking society. Some argue that divorce didn't have much of an emotional toll on children, since they were raised in such a communal environment where they were surrounded by other family members. Others believe that divorce did affect children, particularly in cases where the parents were wealthy or powerful, and the children were caught in a struggle over inheritance or family influence. Whatever the case, Viking divorce was not about severing ties. It was about finding a practical solution that allowed both parties to move on with their lives. The children, though affected, were still raised with strong familial ties, even if those ties were spread across multiple households. This speaks to the Viking ability to adapt to changing circumstances without losing sight of what really mattered: family, legacy, and survival. In a way, Viking divorce didn't just break apart marriages. It reorganized family structures, ensuring that children would still have access to the resources, guidance, and protection they needed. While it might seem strange to us today, where we think of children as being deeply impacted by divorce, Viking society had a more collective approach. Divorce wasn't about breaking up families. It was about adjusting and reconfiguring them in a way that still provided for the children's future. So, next time you hear someone say that divorce in modern society is the worst thing that could happen to kids, just remember, the Vikings managed to navigate those waters centuries ago, and they did it with a focus on practicality and communal support. Now that we've explored how Viking divorce affected the individuals involved and the family structure, let's look at the question: how long did Viking marriages actually last? Was divorce something that happened frequently, or was it a rare occurrence? In Viking society, marriages were often seen as strategic alliances rather than romantic unions, so it's not surprising that the longevity of a marriage was largely determined by its usefulness to both parties. A marriage wasn't just about personal happiness. It was about securing property, making alliances, and ensuring the survival of one's bloodline. So, how long would a Viking marriage last before divorce became inevitable? The answer isn't straightforward. Some marriages would last a lifetime, especially those that were built on strong alliances, or where both partners continued to fulfill their roles within the household and society. Other marriages, however, would end much sooner, often because they were no longer serving the needs of either party. A Viking man might decide to divorce his wife if she failed to produce heirs, or if she was no longer able to contribute to the household in a way that met his expectations. Likewise, a Viking woman might seek a divorce if her husband was unfaithful, abusive, or simply didn't fulfill his marital duties. In these cases, the divorce was seen as a practical solution to a problem, rather than a dramatic failure. Historians still debate how common Viking divorce actually was. Some argue that, due to the Viking emphasis on practicality, divorce was a relatively rare occurrence. After all, marriages were carefully planned, and once they were formed, they were meant to last long enough to ensure that property and resources were secured for the next generation. In other words, the Vikings were in it for the long haul, at least as long as the marriage continued to be beneficial. If the marriage failed to live up to its purpose, divorce was the natural next step. Others believe that divorce was more common than we might think, especially in Viking societies where power struggles and shifting alliances were frequent. If a marriage was no longer serving its strategic purpose, it was quickly dissolved, and both parties were free to seek new alliances through remarriage. In this sense, divorce wasn't seen as a failure. It was simply a part of the natural flow of life. It's worth noting that Viking society didn't have the same social stigma attached to divorce that we do today. Divorce wasn't a moral failing. It was just part of the Viking way of doing things. If you're wondering how long a typical Viking marriage lasted, the most honest answer is that it varied widely. Some marriages might last decades, while others were short-lived, lasting only as long as it took to secure a bloodline or a political alliance. But in Viking society, divorce wasn't a tragic event. It was just another part of the system, a necessary tool for ensuring stability and survival. What's fascinating here is that Viking marriages, despite their pragmatic nature, were still dynamic. They didn't just stay the same forever. Marriages evolved, and if something went wrong, there was no hesitation in taking the necessary steps to fix it. Whether that meant renegotiating the terms of the marriage or divorcing and moving on. Unlike today, where a relationship might be dragged through years of emotional turmoil before divorce is granted, Viking marriages were simply adjusted to fit the needs of the individuals involved and the greater community. No drama, no prolonged sadness, just a shift in the structure when it was necessary. Historians argue that the relatively low rate of divorce in Viking society could also be attributed to their cultural values. Viking families often valued stability and continuity, so marriages that lasted long enough to establish secure families were a priority. However, if something wasn't working, the Viking approach to marriage was about fixing it, whether that meant repairing the marriage or dissolving it altogether. In any case, divorce was simply another tool in their pragmatic toolkit, one that helped them maintain the order of their society. As we wind down our exploration of Viking divorce, let's take a step back and reflect on how their approach to relationships and divorce still resonates with us today. At first glance, Viking divorce might seem like an odd, pragmatic affair, a far cry from our emotional, sometimes messy modern divorces. But when you really think about it, the Viking way of handling divorce was about balance, fairness, and practicality. Things that we could arguably learn from today. Viking society didn't shy away from difficult decisions. They faced challenges head-on, and relationships, marriages especially, were treated as a vital part of societal function. Their approach wasn't about letting emotions cloud judgment or dragging things out in courtrooms. Divorce, in the Viking world, was a straightforward process designed to ensure that both parties could go on with their lives without unnecessary drama or financial ruin. It was all about practicality. If a marriage wasn't working, it was dissolved. The focus wasn't on blaming anyone. It was about doing what was best for the individuals involved and for the larger community. One of the most striking elements of Viking divorce was how it kept the stability of the clan intact. Divorce wasn't just an individual affair. It was a communal one. It didn't end in bitterness or isolation. Instead, it was a process that helped individuals move on while ensuring that the family's wealth, children, and resources were preserved. There was no sense of shame around divorce. It was simply a pragmatic decision. And, in many ways, this sense of community care provided a kind of emotional safety net. The Vikings understood that life was harsh, and they didn't waste time on things that couldn't be fixed. Instead, they moved forward, ensuring that their communities remained stable and strong. Looking at how the Vikings approached relationships and divorce makes you think about how much we've complicated things in the modern world. Divorce today is often stigmatized, seen as a personal failure, or marked by protracted legal battles. It's a deeply emotional and complex process, and the societal weight we place on it can sometimes make it feel like the end of the world. Yet, Viking divorce was none of that. It was straightforward, efficient, and above all, practical. Divorce wasn't about the failure of love. It was about recalibrating to ensure survival. Maybe there's something to be said for that. Of course, Vikings lived in a different time, a time when survival was the top priority. Their approach to relationships was shaped by their environment, where the harshness of their world left little room for lingering emotional attachments. Love was important, yes, but the pragmatic aspects of life, family, property, and legacy, were far more central to their worldview. In a way, their approach to divorce was a reflection of their broader outlook on life. It wasn't about emotions or personal failure. It was about securing your place in a brutal world, ensuring that your family and community could thrive, and moving forward when things didn't work out. And what about us? In a world where divorce can often lead to years of grief, financial strain, and social stigma, maybe we could take a cue from the Vikings. Maybe, in some cases, the simplest solution is to let go and move on. Divorce doesn't have to be a catastrophic event. It doesn't have to mean the end of everything. Sometimes, it can just be a reset, a chance to start over, with a little more wisdom and a little less emotional baggage. So, as we say goodbye to our journey through Viking divorce, take a moment to think about the Viking way: practical, fair, and efficient. It might not have been glamorous, but it worked. And perhaps, just perhaps, there's something we can learn from their no-nonsense approach to life's toughest decisions. Now, dim the lights, relax, and let the calming thoughts of Viking practicality and efficiency ease you into a peaceful night's sleep.